On May 23rd, 1994, 4-year-old Kali Ann Poulton went missing. On a near-perfect mid-spring evening, the weather was ideal for riding a big wheel around her apartment complex. Other kids were outside enjoying the day, and she wanted to have some fun too. With plans to take her daughter to McDonald's, Kali Ann's mother went outside to gather up her daughter. Kali Ann was nowhere to be found, and a 2-year search for the missing 4-year-old was soon underway. Hello. Welcome to another episode of What Were They Thinking? True Crime Podcast. I'm your host, Philip Tomaso. Hello, this is Phil Tomaso. Today is Monday, March 27th. It's also my brother Paulie's birthday. He's the baby of the family. Happy birthday, Paulie, from everyone here on the podcast channel. Today we're going to be talking about another case that is extremely emotional for me. Takes place right in the area where I was born and raised. Like you'll notice, most of mine are Western New York focused cases. This one is called A Nightmare in East Rochester, the kidnapping of Kali Ann Poulton. Kali Ann Poulton. East Rochester is sandwiched between Pittsford and Perrington in Monroe County, New York, just southeast of the city of Rochester, and only about 10 minutes away from where I was born and raised and still live today. On May 23rd, 1994, 4-year-old Kali Ann Poulton went missing. Kali Ann and her mother, Judy Gifford Tosh, lived on Gleason Circle at the Woodland Estates apartment complex. The small apartment complex surrounded a tiny forest of trees and backed up to the I-490, which is an interstate, an expressway. May 23rd was a Monday, a comfortable 65 degrees and partly cloudy. It was a near perfect mid-spring evening. The weather was, like I said, ideal for riding a big wheel around the apartment complex. I had a big wheel. I bet a lot of you had big wheels. At least, this is what Kali Ann had thought. She nagged at her mother for permission to cruise around the complex on her own big wheel. Like I said, there was other kids outside enjoying the day. There was no reason why she shouldn't be out there enjoying it as well. Judy finally gave in. It was staying lighter a little longer. Winter was long since over. Spring was in full swing. Judy's only condition was that Kali Ann stay close to the front of their building and not go riding off. Kali Ann was an only child, and Judy was extremely protective of her 4-year-old daughter. While Kali Ann cruised her big wheel up and down the sidewalk in front of their building, Judy was busy inside the apartment. She was stuffing inserts into magazines that she would soon have to deliver. It was a second job. Her long-term goal was to save enough money for a Disney World vacation for the two of them. The short-term goal was to take Kali Ann to McDonald's after the magazines were delivered. After a few minutes, Judy completed the task of stuffing the magazines with the inserts, and she loaded the magazines into the car for delivery. But when she called out for Kali Ann, her daughter was nowhere to be found. With a mother's intuition triggered, Judy knew something was terribly wrong. Springing into immediate action, as any mother would do, Judy ran through the complex, shouting out her daughter's name. Other people who also lived in the complex joined Judy in this hunt for Kali Ann and her big wheel. Everyone in the complex was familiar with Kali Ann and Judy and the big wheel. The petite young girl with long blonde hair, dimples, and a huge smile was very social, very friendly. She loved pulling up on her big wheel and engaging her neighbors in conversation. Monroe County Sheriff's Office investigator Patrick Crow indicated about 20 minutes into the search, Judy came across a person known as Mark Christie. Christie, 25 years old at the time, had moved into the complex roughly 6 weeks prior with his girlfriend, who later becomes his wife, and their 18-month-old son, Alex. Christie was in untied sneakers, and he was headed to the complex playground with his child. So Judy stopped him and asked him if he'd seen Kali Ann, but Christie said that he hadn't. At this point, Judy called 911. She told the 911 operator that her daughter was missing. Saying something like this out loud makes it real. An anxious panic filled her. Her nightmare was just beginning. The fire and police department showed up. Um, Police brought a dog in to assist in the search for Kali Ann. Immediately, first responders, they got right down to work. They searched the apartment complex. They went door to door and searched apartments. But there was no sign of Kali Ann or her big wheel. On that Tuesday, two Monroe County Sheriff's detectives showed up at Judy's apartment. They had a laundry list of questions for Judy. After all, Judy was supposedly the last one to see Kali Ann before the child disappeared. There were no signs of an abduction, no witnesses to anything out of the ordinary, so naturally the detectives were looking hard at Judy as a person of interest. It's common for police to focus on family in these types of situations. Unfortunately, the time spent looking at Judy as a suspect was time not spent looking for Kali Ann or the person who took her. The investigative delay could only prove detrimental. Investigators did ask if Judy could identify anyone she thought might be responsible for the abduction, or if there was anyone living in the complex who paid too much attention to the 4-year-old. At first, Judy couldn't think of anyone who stood out as a potential kidnapper, right? Because if you thought somebody was a potential kidnapper, you'd be even more on guard. But she couldn't think of anyone that stood out. And then she remembered Mark Christie. He was new to the area. She told the investigators this. He just gives me the creeps, she'd said. And then she described how Christie had told her on more than one occasion how beautiful Kali Ann was. Once, Christie had even asked Judy if Kali Ann would ever tell her if someone had touched her inappropriately. That's a red flag. So without delay, the police sense the same red flags I'm talking about. Without delay, the police went over and questioned Mark Christie. It turns out Christie had a criminal record, nothing even closely resembling kidnapping or involving children, though. Christie was originally from Hilton, a small town on the west side of Monroe County, a good 20 minutes away from East Rochester. He was interviewed for several hours, and he maintained that he had nothing to do with Kali Ann's disappearance. He denied any involvement in the missing child. Although a lot of people wrote Christie off as just weird or creepy, but not a kidnapper, the police never did. They had a feeling about him. There was just no proof to link Christie to Kali Ann's disappearance. They kept loose tabs on Christie and at times reminded him that they were always there to talk about options of returning Kali Ann with her mother. This went on for over 2 years. In the meantime, missing person flyers circulated around Monroe County and neighboring states. I can personally recall seeing Kali Ann's poster, her missing person poster, taped inside car windows and on store windows everywhere. These posters were everywhere. This is pre-social media. So someone had to go out and hang these and share them and distribute them all over the place, and they did. It was like a Christmas photo with a lighted tree in the background. Kali Ann was smiling at the camera, sitting in a brown wicker chair. Perhaps a new Christmas dress is what she's wearing in that photo. And the posters ended up going national, appearing on Oprah and America's Most Wanted. Finding Kali Ann was trending before trending was a thing, before there was, like I said, any real sense of social media to help spread word of the abduction. Christie and his family now had been evicted from the Woodland Estates a few weeks after Kali Ann's disappearance. This is what gets me. Apparently, the front office received multiple complaints that Christie had been exposing himself to young children who lived in the complex. Is it just me that's like, oh yeah, that can't connect one and one to get to two on that one? So then in August of 1996, it was, while Mark Christie and his family were living in an apartment complex in Wayne County, which borders along the east side of Monroe County, just past where they were. Christie and his wife, like I said, the two had gotten married by this point, had had an argument. And during the fight, Christie was hoping to garner sympathy from her by admitting he kidnapped and murdered 4-year-old Kali Ann Poulton. This is how he was going to garner sympathy from his wife by telling her he killed a child. His wife immediately snatched up their son, Alex, and fled. She went directly to her father's house, and while there, she called 911. And good for her. The police finally had a solid break in the case. It didn't matter that in New York, an admission to a spouse was considered confidential and privileged, meaning police needed more than her say so. At least this was a starting point, a real starting point that they could grab onto. It was more than the police have been able to gather in the last 2 years anyway. So they, at least now they had more focus. Even if they never gave Christie up as a person of interest, at least now they had something to link to it. So Patrick Crow, the investigator we talked about earlier, still one of the lead investigators in this seemingly cold case at this point, drove immediately to Wayne County with hopes of once again interviewing Mark Christie. When he arrived, Christie's mother was at the apartment. She met the investigator outside. She informed him, and I can picture this. She informed him he'd hired an attorney and wasn't available to speak with police at this time. I'm sure it was a lot more animated and colorful of an exchange than what I just depicted. But she said he's got an attorney. He's not available to talk at this time. It is where it gets fun. I love this part of the story. Christie went against everything his mother just relayed and agreed to have coffee with Patrick. So all Christie wanted in return was a ride to his attorney's office afterward. So Patrick, in his unmarked police car, shares coffee with Christie, and the two start to talk. Christie's not in cuffs while he's in this unmarked car. And the topic discussed is obvious. What happened to Kali Ann Poulton? Christie didn't want to get too specific, not without his attorney present, but he did tell the investigator that Kali Ann did not suffer. That had to make Patrick's stomach turn. On the drive to Christie's attorney's office, Patrick asked if Mark was hungry. Mark Christie indicated he was starving. So the two decided they would stop at a very popular Italian restaurant, Roncone's, for something to eat. Apparently, Christie had the chicken parm and spaghetti, and the investigator went with the linguine with sausage in a red sauce. Why is this important? I don't know, but I found it in almost all of my research that covers this story. What they ate seems to have made every article ever written on the subject. And I'm very familiar with Roncone. Fantastic place to go eat. So stopping for a bite was the perfect way for Patrick to form a connection between the two. At a small restaurant, it was hard to feel like cops and robbers, right? They were two guys breaking bread together. And over a hearty meal, what goes better than some nice conversation? Mopping sauce from the plate with fresh bread, Christie began talking. Playing into Christie's need to feel superior, Patrick told the man across from him that he had beaten the police fair and square. Little psychology 101. Christie ate it up. He said he didn't want to brag, but admitted that getting rid of the big wheel had been ingenious on his part. He's bragging. He didn't want to brag, but he was bragging. Patrick nodded. He's like giving him full mock agreement. Credit where credit is due. Christie's loving it. He was just spouting off about how clever he was, but he wanted more. He wanted to give the details. Just admitting he was clever wasn't good enough. And since Patrick wasn't asking any pointed questions, Christie couldn't help himself. He asked the investigator if he wanted to know how he had done it, how he had gotten rid of Kali Ann's big wheel. So, acting only slightly interested and twisting his linguine around his fork, he said, "Sure." He wanted to know how Christie had managed to pull such a fast one on police. And again, Christie was eating this up. Christie said the big wheel was in the house for 3 days, and police missed it when they searched his apartment. Police had gone through all of the apartments that day in May 2 years prior. Apparently, Christie then cut the big wheel into pieces, stuffed them in hiding spots like drawers, into clothing like down pant legs. And since police were looking for a big wheel, a full-size big wheel, and a child, not small pieces, looking in rooms they didn't see either, and they moved on. So Christie said his wife never suspected a thing. Then he filled duffel bags with the pieces and slowly transported the bags to his car. And then he drove beyond the police roadblocks that had been set up, undetected. He dropped pieces of the big wheel all over the county. As if completely intrigued, the big wheel wasn't really what Patrick was interested in. It was good to find out how he had done it, but it wasn't what he was there for. The big question still hung between them. What happened to Kali Ann Poulton? Patrick decided to keep the conversation game going. He tried letting Christie believe none of this was his fault. He explained to Christie how everyone would consider him a child killer, a child killing monster, if you will, unless he told his side of the story. It would be a way for everyone else to understand why he did whatever it was he had done. This was an investigative technique, minimizing the guilt, almost siding with the criminal to put them at ease. And Italian Goombas, paisanos. Christie became curious about a prison sentence, wondering how much time he might receive for a crime like this. Patrick informed him, he might get 25 years, maybe even a life sentence. Christie didn't think being locked away would be fair to his wife and Alex, his son. Patrick told him the time was now to get right with himself, his family, and with God. And Christie agreed. He wanted to come clean and tell the investigator what happened to Kali Ann Poulton. He reiterated that the child did not suffer. Here we go now, guys. You ready? Hang on for this confession. He confessed that he strangled the 4-year-old, but that he didn't do anything else to her. Patrick wanted clarification, so he asked if that meant he did not have sex with the child. And Christie said yes. He did not have sex with Kali Ann Poulton. Christie went on to explain what happened in May of 1994. He said Kaylee rolled up on her big wheel and wanted to play with with Christie's son, Alex. Christie invited her into the apartment and placed the big wheel in his kitchen out of sight. Kali Ann went upstairs and started to play with Alex's toys. About 10 minutes later, he heard Judy outside calling for Kali Ann. Christie said he panicked and strangled Kali Ann to death. Patrick thought Christie was leaving parts out. He suspected the man was actually molesting Kali Ann prior to Judy calling out for her daughter. And he suspected Kali Ann could also hear her mother's frantic cries. This is where it's heartbreaking, because I believe Patrick's absolutely right. Christie said he then carried the lifeless child downstairs and he put her on the dining room floor. He quickly put on his shoes, grabbed Alex, who was present during all of this, and went outside. And that was when he ran into Judy while he was on his way to the complex playground. Inside his apartment on the floor, is the lifeless body of Kali Ann Poulton. Right there. Judy's right out front, and her daughter is right inside that apartment. And what a shame. Once back home, Christy said he placed Kali Ann's body into a laundry basket and covered her with a blanket. And when no one was around, he brought the basket out to his car, put his son into the car seat as well, and then he drove to the Nortel company where he worked as a security guard. He drove around to the back of the facility and he put the laundry basket with Kali Ann hidden inside just outside of a utility door. Then he drove back to the front of the building, went to the front entrance, and he told those inside he'd left something behind and was only there to pick it up. At the rear of the building, so he walks through the building now, Christie opened the utility door and he retrieved the laundry basket. He carried Kali Ann Poulton to the top of a 30,000-gallon tank filled with liquid coolant, and he dropped her inside of it. Patrick inquired if Christie had cut Kali open to prevent her from floating in the tank, but Christie said he didn't. He said instead he'd weighed her down with a piece of heavy metal equipment. Patrick asked if Christie kept the blanket used to cover her in the laundry basket or any of her belongings, but Christie said he'd gotten rid of everything. He even left her earrings in her ears. Maybe with remorse, Christie admitted that it never should have happened and implied that her death had been a waste. But ironically, after dumping her body in the tank, Christie joined the rest of the community and participated in the nightly searches for Kali Ann. Patrick paid the bill at Roncone's, and Christie even left a $2 tip. And then they drove to the police station. And while at the police station, Christie finally called his lawyer before he was arrested for Kali Ann Poulton's murder. It was no longer an abduction. Now we're looking at a murder. In October of 1997, Christie pleaded guilty to killing Kali Ann Poulton and was sentenced to 25 years to life at Sing Sing Correctional Facility in Ossining, New York, a maximum security prison 30 miles just north of New York City and about 7 hours east of East Rochester. Although Judy had answers, Judy had some closure, and Kali Ann was finally laid to rest, Judy always thought her daughter was still alive and that one day the two of them would be reunited. So then to learn that her daughter was not alive and had been murdered minutes after going outside is one of those things that I'm sure sits with her to this day. So Judy tries to find comfort in the fact that her daughter died the same day she vanished, that she didn't suffer for very long. Is one of the only things that brings her an odd sense of peace, according to Judy. But this isn't where the podcast ends, where you would think it would naturally end, right? Child was kidnapped, murdered, killer admits it, gets sentenced 25 years to life. This is where the story should end. It doesn't. There's more to Mark Christie's story. Turns out Kali Ann Poulton was not the first person Mark Christie murdered. While in prison, Christie confessed to another brutal killing. On November 29th, 1988, 74-year-old Viola Manville was beaten to death while walking on the railroad tracks in Hilton, New York, where she lived. She was shot with a pellet gun and bludgeoned with a railroad tie. Now remember, Mark Christie grew up in Hilton. I hate to use the term, but these were his stomping grounds. Although Christie claimed responsibility for the woman's death to other teenagers at the time of the murder, at the time this happened in 1988, he did get questioned by the police for the grisly murder, but he said he didn't do it to the police, and there was no proof to say otherwise. So police discounted Christie of the crime. 3 years later, when, after hours of interviews with investigators, the blame was pinned on a truck driver named Frank Sterling, who eventually confessed to the killing and was ultimately convicted for the murder and sentenced. After spending almost 19 years in prison, and all the while Sterling's maintaining that he was innocent and the confession was coerced, Sterling was finally exonerated. Initially, a judge didn't want to overturn the Sterling conviction because he thought Christie was just talking a big game to other prisoners while incarcerated. The Innocence Project was instrumental in assisting Sterling, and his never wavering stand that he was not responsible for Viola's death. DNA testing and forensic evidence proved what Sterling claimed all along. He had not killed Viola. Christie took responsibility for the Manville killing, and then rather than put her family through the ordeal of the trial, he just admitted it. He took it. The defense lawyer, James Noble, was explaining. But the prosecutor said Christie never showed remorse in prison interviews and almost laughed at what happened to Mr. Sterling. In October 2011, at 39 years old, Christie, who knew too many of the details of the murder not to be the sadistic killer of Manville, was convicted of second-degree murder and was sentenced to 20 years to life for the violent death of Viola Manville. The two convictions run consecutively, making Christie first eligible for parole in the year 2041, at which time Mark Christie will be 72 years old. After years of protesting his innocence, Sterling said he felt anger and relief when told he was being freed. He said, "Yeah, I'm mad. I'm glad Christie finally did the right thing. Wish it was a lot sooner." I'm sure he does. However, this just keeps getting weirder and weirder. I don't think Frank Sterling is completely a victim. Okay. In July 2011, Sterling returned to court on 7 misdemeanor charges of sexually abusing an 11-year-old boy. And then if he got convicted of that, he would have gotten another year in jail, which is ridiculous. A year in jail for abusing an 11-year-old boy sexually. However, it wasn't long after he was released and he was living with his fiancée in South Carolina that Sterling died of a heart attack. This was in 2017, and he was 53 years old. So perhaps he wasn't guilty of Manville's death, and it's quite possible the man had other, perhaps equally sinister skeletons in his closet. The big money settlement for wrongly being imprisoned brought out family and friends who wanted a piece of his pie, and he was taken advantage of financially by these people. Karma it's like the only thing I can come up with. Okay, you went to prison, you didn't kill this woman, but I'm betting you did some things that were vile prior to that, which probably is why you were being looked at in the first place. And then as soon as you get out, you're exposing yourself to children, or I'm sorry, molesting. I'm confusing Christie now with Sterling. But that, you know what, that's neither here nor there for this particular episode. So let's go with this. The main thing is Christie and the fact he is in prison for at least another 20 years or 18 years till 2041. Another 18 years, yeah, for certain. I guess we have to pray that the Release People Aging in Prison campaign doesn't try to butt in and push for an earlier release. If you don't know who I mean or what I'm talking about, I encourage you to listen to episode number 5, A Nightmare in Penfield. I don't hold back my feelings when it comes to dangerous organizations like the Release People Aging in Prison campaign. That is a dangerous organization. Okay, so for one, I take comfort knowing Christie will remain behind bars until at least 2041, and that parole is denied every 2 years thereafter until the man passes away behind bars. That's what I'm hoping for. At one point in or around 1999, this is funny, Mark Christie filed with the courts for a name change, okay? Because in New York, probably the rest of the country at the time, there were very few people who didn't know the name Mark Christie. And feared, hit my mic there. The man feared for his life in prison, right? He figured with a different name, no one would know who he was, what he had done. He didn't want to be branded a child killer. Kali Ann's mother had no problem telling reporters his being branded a child killer is part of the punishment. She went on to say he has to live with the stigma and humiliation that goes with it for the rest of his life, just like I have to live without my daughter for the rest of my life. That's right, Judy. I back you 100% on that. So an informal petition with well over 100,000 signatures was started to stop Christie from changing his name. For the record, Mark Christie is still Mark Christie, and there was no name change granted in the courts. And once again, bringing things back around, there's so much information on this case, but every year, and I want to finish this out with some wrap ups, but every year, Judy, Kali Ann's mother, visits the playground at the apartment complex. She says she loved it there. I walked the playground where she played. It's bittersweet. I'm getting emotional. When I'm there, I feel closer to her. Excuse me. Judy said this during the 25th interview in 2019 with Rochester's own Ginny Ryan from WHAM 13, an ABC affiliate. The Kali we know is frozen in time, captured in home videos, smiling and playing. 25 years later, Kali would have been 29. Tosh, Judy, wonders what she'd be doing today. Maybe graduated from college and married. To overcome the belief she didn't deserve happiness, Judy reflects, if I took my own life, which I contemplated, then you won. You took her life. You're not taking the rest of my life. That's where I stand strong. And the you in that is obviously Mark Christie. Judy did get married on what would have been Kali Ann's 8th birthday. And she and her husband Floyd are close to celebrating a 25th anniversary of their own. Although she never had any more children, she does enjoy being an aunt. And I didn't want this episode to end on such depressing notes. And while I'm not going to apologize for getting emotional, I just wanted to follow up with Judy. I hope what I shared provides some comfort to some of the listeners. And that, we remember Judy and Kali Ann and the other millions of missing children and their families. Thank you for listening to What Were They Thinking True Crime Podcast. As always, like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. New episodes every Monday.